So welcome to a talk alongside our exhibition, Here We Are, Women in Design. For this exhibition, we investigated the role of professional women designers since 1900. And we did it because the history of design is documented and curated by scholars, historians, custodians, archivists, and the designers themselves. But it's no secret that the protagonists and also mostly the authors of that narrative have mostly been men, and white men at that, which is another story. In our exhibition, we try to identify why some women have been overlooked and why women in general are not part of the histories and narratives in design in the way that they should and can be. Of course, we did it as a museum. So we worked primarily with our collection, and we were also very aware of the contribution that we wanted to make with that. We feel that it's a topic that's absolutely not finished. It's very large, and that we only contribute a small part to that picture. And that's why I'm super happy to welcome two authors, critics, and curators who have been engaging with that topic for a number of years, Matylda Krzykowski and Alice Rawsthorn. They have engaged with it, of course, through other ways, not necessarily engaging with the collection. So we would like to talk about the formats that we might be using to kind of create more visibility, to address existing shortcomings, and to generally think about this topic further. So I might give a very quick introduction to you both. Hello, Matylda and Alice.
Hi.
Hello. So Alice Rawsthorn probably doesn't need an introduction, but I'll give a very short one anyway. She's one of the most renowned design critics working today. You might be familiar with her books, Hello World, Where Design Meets Life, and more recently, Design as an Attitude. And also, she started with Paola Antonelli during the pandemic, the Design Emergency Project that investigates design role in helping us build a better future. There are too many activities and accomplishments to name here, but in this context, I would just like to point out that Alice has been tirelessly discussing the role of women in design, also through her incredibly popular Instagram account, which has become a central resource for anyone in the design industry. And the second person here is, hello. So the second person here is Matylda Krzykowski. She's a critic and curator who defies any stereotype or definition. I try to put something together, but it's very hard. She curates, writes, teaches around design and the design of space. And a colleague, James Taylor Foster, he described her very succinctly as organically interdisciplinary. Among other projects around women in design, Matylda also curated an exhibition in 2019 called Add to the Cake.
Co-curated.
You know what? I actually put that on here, and I didn't see my own notes.
That's how
co-curated, very important. It's something that we'll get to later, I think, the idea of co-curation. It was called Add to the Cake, and it also included a symposium called A Woman's Work. She's very interested in questioning existing formats and developing new ways to approach designs, past, present, and future. And I'm super excited to discuss that today. So welcome to you both.
Thank you very much.
So we thought we'd structure the talk a little bit to think about addressing women in design in the past, present, and future, to give it some structure. So I'd like to start with you, Alice, talking about how you first came to think about women in design as a theme or as a topic that you would engage with, and when that happened.
Okay, well, for me, it was part of my passion for design and also my passion for politics and for feminism in particular. I've been an ardent feminist ever since I was a teenager. So my great role models were people like Angela Davis, I mean, those incredible feminist pioneers of the 70s. And I was part of the punk generation. So we were an activist generation. So it's great to see Gen X being as active politically as we are. So given that I decided to focus my work on design, and given that I see design predominantly as a social, political, cultural an ecological tool, obviously analysing its political impact was central, and also one of the aspects of design I was most fascinated by. And I was, of course, horrified to discover that when I looked at design history, to see quite how acute the oppression, neglect, exclusion and marginalisation of women were in what you've rightly described as a white, cis male dominated and deeply misogynistic culture. It's critical to note that all this prejudice doesn't, and indeed didn't, just apply to women. I mean, at a time like this one, when it's increasingly important to develop a more eclectic and inclusive understanding of gender, it also applies to anyone whose gender identity is fluid, queer, trans, in other words, not cis male, and it also applies to all other communities who face discrimination, whether it's because of ethnicity, geography, or demographics. So it's a much broader problem, but misogyny is an important element of it. And the proof of this is incontrovertible. If you flick through design history books, look at the roll call of museum collections and exhibitions, you see cis white males dominating at all times, even when much of the work on the projects involved was actually done by women, but has been routinely misattributed to supposedly great white male design heroes for many years. So Lily Reich and Mies van der Rohe would be one example, and until recently, Aino Marcio Alto and Alvar Alto. And this creates a vicious cycle of continuing exclusion because so little information is available on anyone else. I mean, it's great to see the Vitra Design Museum addressing gender with the We Are Here exhibition, but it's also telling that this is the first time that the museum has mounted one of its major touring exhibitions that focuses on women.
Yes, it absolutely is. And I think we also kind of spoke about this in our in a brief conversation that we had before this conversation now. And it's also really been quite interesting for us what you just say in terms of rediscovering women in history, because we've spent our time looking at so many protagonists, actually, because we used our collection as a basis, which is a kind of different kind of research. And we also realized how arduous that work can be, as you just said, to kind of really find work out what the contribution of somebody actually has been, especially in those kind of couple relationships as well. And so we definitely feel like we've made a start with it. For us as a museum, also we feel like we've been part of a much larger movement towards that, but it also has shown us how much work there still is to do for us, but also for others, because we especially also need, I think, to really work together as critics and curators and museum people, but also with academia, for instance, to kind of provide really the very, very thorough research that might go over years just into the life of somebody, because a lot of information still remains lost.
Lost or purposely excluded, I would say.
Yeah, exactly. That's also, I mean, I think purposefully excluded, but we also did realize that wherever there is somebody, I think it's been one of the major realizations out of many that we've had, because there hasn't just been the one, but we've also realized, for instance, with somebody like Trude Petri, she's in our exhibition and was a very prolific ceramicist, designed for Cartier in Berlin, the Royal Porcelain Manufactory. And some of her work is still being sold today, but yet about her, nobody actually knows all that much, especially what happened to her in her later life. The same thing applies to Marianne Brandt, who is always associated with the Bauhaus, but after the Bauhaus, a lot of the information about her remains kind of unclear where it is or what exactly she did, how she did it. And I think Alice is also probably knows a lot about this topic, just how important it is that there is someone, whether that's an institution or a family or an academic entity, who kind of stands in for the interests in preserving the legacy of that person. That's really, really become clear to us.
That's absolutely true. But I mean, really at the core of this is perception of value.
Mm.
Work that is perceived as being valuable, whether that's economically on the auction market or in terms of its cultural and intellectual value, is preserved, and the champions of those estates and those legacies are listened to and their requests are acted upon. But if work isn't perceived as being of value, it is neglected and eventually it disappears. And tragically, this has happened to so many women's work over the decades.
It actually even still happens, because I mean, maybe I'm jumping because Alice had the chance to explain her point of view and how she actually defined herself or found herself in advocating for the female practice. Of course, I mean, first of all, you can say that Alice and I are women, so it's natural that you kind of, from a point of, from someone who has actually the experience, you see it, you observe it, but you obviously you think about the possibilities of changing this kind of systems. And you've been introducing me as a critic and as a curator. And it's interesting because I don't feel like a critic. I feel just like a human being who kind of tries to make sense of the world and put the energy into the systemic, the possibility of systemic change. And I am trained as a designer, and I still see myself as a designer. But I think the reason why I didn't became a practicing designer is because I knew that I would be excluded from the beginning, and I was. The moment when I put a foot into a design academy, it was told, you were told that you do not belong into the metal workshop or the wood workshop, and it's this kind of attitude still exists. The moment when you open up books in the curriculum of all the academies, they are male-led. The history is written by a lot of men that kind of want to keep that kind of construction of this connotation of that design is still like male-led or defined by men. And in that kind of sense, I did understand very, very early on that if I want to kind of shift the discipline into, like basically closing the diversity and equality gap, I have to put myself into a position where I can make the decisions. And the decisions I do at the moment, I do them as a curator. I do it as a person who develops formats, or Darren Sacchetti, who I co-curated a women's work and add to the cake, because a women's work was a conference. But the most repeated sentence in this conference was, we have to add to the canon. And some people would say, cake, what does it mean, a cake? It's just like a decorative object. And Amelie Klein, the curator, said at the beginning, like, it's like putting a cherry on top, and we don't want to be the cherry. But I do have the impression that if you put a lot of new layers on the existing canon, and that's what we really have to do, you transfer the cake, and it becomes a much more multi-layered, exciting cake. And I think that's what you have to do when you are one of the gatekeepers that is in a museum and opens the door for this specific practice. When you're head of a collection and you can choose who you collect. If you write a book and you just think, okay, how can I diversify? How I gonna put 50% of people into this book that I don't know, because we also have an issue with nepotism in this industry very strongly. Because when you look who works with who supports who comes back, And I mean, I would definitely also attack the Vitra Design Museum for reproducing a very close, tiny network in the exhibitions, but also in the public programming, but also in who they invite to write about design. So and the question is, how can you break that kind of system?
I actually feel very much the same way, how you break it. And I've really liked some of the things that you've said in other contexts, Matylda. I can't remember where I heard you say it, but I know that you said simple things like, next time you invite a person for a talk, make sure it's a woman. And I think you also, when you had the Basel, right, you had, which was an exhibition space here in Basel, you kind of acted, or you had the rule for yourself that you would always have 50% of people that you didn't work with before, correct?
Yeah, it's even, I mean, it started actually when I co-founded in 2011. The first event that we did, and I mean, that's actually even a funny story, because we invited 9 practitioners to the first event. And after looking at the list of names, we had 7 men and one woman on the list. And we all agreed that this is completely disbalanced, but it's 10 years ago. And we actually found a person online that we thought the practice looked super exciting. And we sent an email, that person said yes. And that person is called Camille Blin. But when Camille Blin came in, it was a man, because in the French-speaking Switzerland, it's actually it's a non-gendered name. But still, I still look back and ask myself, what did I do as someone who has the financial resources, a location, a network, and all the framework to make an experimental space about design, but I didn't do it. And I tell this story all the time because it's sometimes much more interesting to talk about the things that you mistakenly did wrong in order to address that. A lot of people do these wrongdoings, but then, okay, now that I know that I've done it wrong, how can I do it better best? You know, and not in a year, not in 3 years, just do it tomorrow. You wake up and you decide, okay, that's the rule. That's the rule of the fund, and that's how we're going to do it.
I think that's really interesting, because I'd also like to share a personal story there, which is firstly in regards to networks. One of the things I did was when we researched, it hasn't found its way into the exhibition, but one of the things I did do was look at all the participants who ever participated in the Aspen conference, the Aspen Design Conference. And it was so few women. It was really what I did find in terms of numbers, like you often do arrive at a kind of a 10% female quote. That's what it's like in our collection or in the Atlas. It sort of hovers around that percent. And I think it's also, we didn't do too much statistical research. These are anecdotal numbers, but it's also something I found in looking at design books and so on. But with this conference, it was actually very little. And what I found even more interesting about it is that most of the people you saw there were also people who were very much connected in their practice, and you knew that. So it's really this sort of very much a document of that nepotism, which you could name any number of big events like the Siam Architecture Conference. It probably was the same. But what I actually want to talk about is we as designers or design curators or critics also sometimes use these mechanisms, right? I at least found me inadvertently doing it. Like you try and tell to a colleague that you've discovered someone really interesting, and then you try and sort of place them in a network. You say they've worked with such and such, or they used to be so-and-so's assistant, and then you sort of reproduce these things. And that's why I find looking at these systems, or at least this historical research, it's really helped me come to this conclusion also for my practice.
Mm-hmm. I also wonder whether, if you look at design today and the gendering of design, it's still intensely problematic, though there has clearly been some progress, just nowhere near enough. And it's very telling, and this is absolutely true for art and literature as well, most areas of culture, that women and other disadvantaged categories, if you like, within society tend to flourish at moments of profound change, and also in areas of radical change. So if you look at the areas of design where more of the leaders globally are cis female, they're almost always the new areas. So social design, for example, you have amazing people like Hilary Cottam, Emily Pillerton, absolutely foregrounded and at the forefront of it. In so many areas of technology, despite the misogynistic culture in the tech industry, again, you have women pioneers. There's even a historical one in Muriel Cooper in terms of design, and people like Lisa Strausfeld and Neri Oxman are very much continuing her mission today. And whereas in the typically industrialized, more old-fashioned areas of design, like product design and furniture design, which for obvious reasons is very important to the Vitra Design Museum, you have these hierarchies. There are established male gatekeepers. It's much, much harder for women and other groups, people of color, for example, queer and trans people, to break into those fields, but it's easier in the newer areas, which is why I think often looking at networks can be counterproductive, because you're often perpetuating the status quo rather than challenging it.
I want to jump into this because, you know, like after I posted a few days ago, I reposted the fact that we're having this conversation. You cannot believe how many messages I got from all spheres of lives of people, you know. And one person, David Bielander, he's a jewelry. He actually texted me and he said he was so impressed by the exhibition because, for example, Louis Birmingham, the box furniture designer, he was not aware of her. And he said that he cannot believe it because when he thinks that she was so many years before Ansumari and
exactly,
she established it basically, but there's a purpose behind the storytelling and the history that was made where she was entirely excluded, you know. And it's, for me, these exhibitions like Here We Are, Women Design is important because I do realize that there's so much energy in communication, in institutions, but also the education system to preparate, like to kind of build up this kind of male connotated practice. But we really have to break that mold, you know. And I ask myself sometimes really, like, and the crazy thing is, like, we talk about what women have to do and how women have to differently behave, but I really think it's questioning or maybe rethinking what is the role of a man in the 21st century, you know, and how can we negotiate it in a softness, but also in a mutual understanding, because this kind of part of listening and talking about it is still missing in all spheres and all disciplines and all kind of formats that exist.
It's absolutely true. And Louise Brigham is a very interesting example. I mean, I too had never heard of her until about 5 years ago when I was doing some research on Rudolf Schindler. And I saw a tiny photograph in a Schindler catalogue I'd picked up in LA years ago of this very Spartan looking minimalist chair. And I was intrigued and I thought it was probably Rietveld. And I looked and it said Louise Brigham. And so I started to research her, and bit by bit, more and more information came out. And fortunately, she was interviewed by the New York Times in, I think, something like 1911. And so this was very much a sort of first person account of her talking about her practice. And I think, in brief, she was, although she's interesting as a furniture designer in that all her furniture was entirely modular and it was made from packing crates. And she designed the sort of formulae and instructions to construct virtually everything you would need in a working class home from packing crates. This included all sorts of what seemed to be non-essential items like umbrella stands and so on. And she did this not because she was specifically interested in furniture design, but because she was a fervent anti-poverty campaigner, as many wealthy, intelligent young women were in the United States in the early 20th century. And she set up a series of skills workshops in New York, which thousands of kids from deprived areas of New York attended. And they were all taught how to make box furniture according to her templates. And she published a book, obviously called Box Furniture, on how to make all, I think it was over 100 individual pieces of furniture from the packing crates. But then, very sadly for we feminists, the story takes a dark turn as she meets and marries a multimillionaire Midwest industrialist, marries him and sort of disappears completely, even from her charity work, let alone her social design work. So I think that was partly one reason, her apparent disinterest in this astonishing experiment in social design later in her life. But I think the other factor is that her impact was as a social designer, not as a furniture designer. And for the decades after that, all the interest would have been in furniture design. You know, it was made from packing crates that had probably all disintegrated after a couple of years. It had no auction value, no museum presence, and nobody would have perceived it as being suitable for either context. Whereas now that the focus of design is very much on strategic and political initiatives like social design projects, she seems so timely and so relevant, and it's a hugely inspiring story.
It is, and I have to say, like, there's too many things. I didn't take any notes, but I could respond to a number of these points because they're all really exciting. First, Matylda, what you said, I think this idea of agenda setting has become really, or not agenda setting, but the way we kind of are able to multiply what we find as a museum. So through this exhibition, I think also the really kind of the exhibition as a tool of adding to the canon has become, not that I didn't know of before, but I know it very much now because it's Louis Brigham has been one of our most kind of shared stories in terms of journalists. When we give them tours, we sort of, it's not that we push it in that way, but it's just such a compelling story. And so it's been multiplied lots of times. That's one point I want to make. The other is that idea that and there were so many social reformers. We only have one other in the exhibition, Jane Addams of Hull House, who you're both familiar with as well. But we also found a lot more women, especially in Berlin, who kind of had strategies of communal housing, but they were known as social reformers. Jane Addams who founded Hull House, won the Nobel Peace Prize, but wasn't sort of recognized in design or architecture until quite recently. But it's, I think, in those areas that we do find a lot of protagonists who should really be part of that story. That's really become quite evident to me through that work as well, and where I think we're kind of not quite finished.
As you said, it should be an ongoing project. The museum's work in this area has just begun. So how is the Vitra Design Museum going to respond to this exhibition? It's clearly generated a huge amount of interest. You as a curator have clearly found it fascinating and very fulfilling. So what impact will it make? For example, how will it affect the collection policy? What percentage of the collection is attributed to women in whole or part currently, and what are your targets to improve that in the future, and how does that also apply to other groups?
I want to add to it, and how much money will be invested in collecting more work by women, and can we expect also a catalogue from that exhibition after the museum, Vitra Design Museum, in the last 10 years have not made a women-focused exhibition? So what can we expect? You know, what has changed within the museum structures for that picture?
Okay. I think one thing that we've really learned from making this exhibition is, while we know that in a museum, especially like ours, that so heavily feeds from its collection, and sort of, you know, we collect in order to exhibit, we exhibit in order to collect. There is a lot of intertwining. And also, I didn't curate this exhibition on my own. There were three of us, and that was on purpose. There's Susanne Graner, who's the head of the collection, and Nina Steinmüller, who's the curator of the collection. So the three of us did that together, which was also to ensure that there is a very strong link between not just now the collection, but also how it's shaped in the future. And I think Alice, if I forgot any of the things that you asked, you will have to ask again, because I'm happy to answer it. We did, of course, and that was the great exercise that we did, was to kind of turn to the collection and really think about, like, how many women do we have there? Is everything correctly attributed, and so on? Because, as you may know, or as many of our viewers perhaps don't, is everything is kept through databases. So we don't have a tool that sort of that shows whether someone is male or female, which goes back to your story, Matylda, of saying, you know, you invited somebody and thought they were a woman, but then a man turned up. And so with us, it's not exactly like that, but we do not necessarily, we don't have a tool that generates automatically the number. But all that research we did when we looked at our collection, we do know that we have, in terms of just the names, not the pieces, just the names, there are 830 or 850, I think, designers in the exhibition, and 130 women. And so that is slightly more than this sort of 10% that are found everywhere. Like 6% of our world leaders at the moment are female, and somehow you always everywhere come across this sort of 6 to 10 to 15% thing. It's something that we found in our research, whether it's looking at our collection, looking at the female designers in the Atlas of Furniture Design, which we also made, and where a lot of our inspiration for making this exhibition came from.
Are you planning, Viviane, to analyze this more systematically in the future? I mean, for example, yet another impediment in terms of uncovering the history of women in design is names. So an example would be Margaretha Heyman, the ceramicist, who, I mean, I have seen her name described, I think, 7 different times, whether it's on museum collections, credits and captions on images, auction catalogues, and so on. She was called Margaretha, and also Greta for short. Her birth name was Heyman. Her first husband was called Lerbenstein, and her second husband was called Marx. And because she was Jewish, she had to leave Nazi Germany and settled in England. Culture that was both misogynistic, anti-modernist, and anti-design, so an unfortunate choice for her. But she is referred to as Margaretha Greta, and then by various combinations of all the surnames, she could easily come up 6 times on the database as apparently 6 different people.
That's a fantastic example, and I think that's something that we really like. Working with 2 collection curators really helped us, making sure that that we do attribute everything correctly. She's a great example, but there are others who only married once, and then it becomes a problem. And also things like we did have, you perhaps know the, this brings me on to another topic that I might speak about later, but you might know a very commercially very successful dining set called Homemaker by Enid Tsini. We had that in our collection, but we never knew it was hers. It was just randomly collected there, probably left over from another exhibition. And so it helped us attribute these things correctly. And so I think what it does is also, if the people who work on the collection really engage with these processes. And also, I think one thing we also did was we know the numbers now, but that is only one step in addressing things. It also depends on, say, for instance, our collection is by its nature very highly specialized. It's not a state big museum. It includes a lot of furniture. And as you said before, Alice, that is a place where there are a lot of male gatekeepers. So naturally, we do not find that many women in it. So we have 2 jobs as sort of thinking about the collection. Find the women who should be in it. And making sure we collect those both historically and in the present, but also perhaps if our focus is not just furniture, but also the interior, which, we do also look at not as systematically as furniture, but we do also look at lighting and other kind of objects of the interior, is to give also more presence to those objects that historically were made by women, which we also sort of brought into the collection as part of the exhibition.
But one thing that I really always wonder, and it's a conversation I have a lot with, because I teach a lot and I work with very upcoming or young, but also very established people who are in different types of fields, is the necessity maybe of deconstructing the stereotypes, because I understand that this job has to be done, maybe unfortunately still now, and I cannot believe that we're still talking about women in design instead of considering them just designers. But I also understand, and I remember I wrote an article from Zaha Hadid who once said that she doesn't want to be called a female architect, but she does understand that she needs to be a role model in order for other women to consider to become an architect. But I do really feel that that this young generation doesn't want to be connotated with these kind of terminologies that kind of then just only go down to gender, because the qualities of the work is not necessarily based on gender. It's more based on what you have experienced and what you've encountered and what has made possible for you, or what do you have access to. And I have to say, I really, when you told me that the title will be Women in Design, and then on top of that, here we are, it made me cringe very much,
You sent me a message, I think. didn't
yeah,
you?
and I really hope that, you know, like that there would be, and that also goes back to language. We need to really find the language to talk about the quality of work that is done not by a white, in the necessary cis man, but like it could have been something like the broader picture or the bigger picture, or I love this series of the New York Times magazine, Almost Famous, you know, because
That is
a lot
cool,
of these
actually.
women
Yeah,
that are
I
in
love
this
that.
exhibition at the Vitra Design Museum have been almost famous, but then there was always some sort of mechanism that was beyond the control. And maybe in that context, you know, back to Louise Brigham, we have to reinventing also the family model, you know, the expectations towards a woman and the role in society, you know, in that kind of sentence, in that kind of context.
But I think we
So
also have to get away from this binary division of gender, because
okay.
all the young people I know have already discounted that completely. They have an innate understanding of their right to represent their gender identity as they wish, with all the nuances of queerness, whether it's trans identity, fluid identity, or whatever. And we really need to get away from that, because it's not just museums and our perceptions of design history that are affected by this, it's our lives and the efficacy with which we can conduct them. And this is going, you know, there's been some incredible work recently in analysing the gendering of industrial design, and how these huge industrial design projects, mass consumer projects that were designed by and therefore for men and tested on men, are dangerous to everyone else. So an example would be Caroline Criado Perez's brilliant book, Invisible Women, in which she uses data to analyze. So, I mean, one of her arguments, she proves statistically that women are 47% likely to be seriously injured in car crashes than men, because car safety systems and even the crash test dummies used to test them are designed based on a so-called sort of modular male body from which all other bodies deviate. I mean, a similar statistic, it affects, I think over 50% of women are likelier to encounter serious problems with heart surgery because the medical equipment, again, is designed by and for men. Now, as more and more of our lives look into the future, are organized and managed by artificial intelligence, neuromorphic and quantum computing and other systems, the level of gender bias in their data is going to become even more damaging. I mean, we already know from numerous research exercises that biometric surveillance software systems, which are now absolutely standard in public places, the people who are likeliest to be accurately identified by them are cis white males without facial hair. Even if they grow a moustache or a beard, they're likelier to be misidentified. Anyone of color, anyone whose gender representation differs from cis male, again, much more likely to be misidentified and therefore liable to wrongful arrest, detention, passport applications or visa applications or credit applications being rejected. These are really serious issues, all of which come down to gendering and gender bias in outdated data. Design has got to address these challenges for the future.
I would like to add a story, because I just curated an exhibition that was a film. It was a TV show that it was called Airtime. And the question was, what is wanted? Because I really thought that it would be interesting to introduce a few contemporary practitioners that really talk about the want out of the discipline, you know, and how they want to expand it. And there was one designer, she studied actually in the industrial design department at ZHDK in Zurich. And she graduated with AI and deconstructing the stereotype of gendering with the help of AI. But she studied in the industrial design department, and her heads of the department almost didn't allow her to graduate with the topic because she didn't make a piece of furniture, you know? So she had to really fight for that topic to be established. But again, the school then didn't make the proper press that they would normally do with other projects, because there's not a pretty picture in an isolated background with a piece of furniture that they can distribute through the network of media and press, because she computer generated an image out of it, which is an exciting image, but she couldn't do it. But but what I just really realized, especially working since I was co-running Depot Basel with experimental discourse and exhibition space in Basel, and I'm still working within this sphere formats, is that there's enough people who want to do or expand. And in this case, with our time, I had 14 practitioners, from an artist who decided to work with design as a methodology to redesign coral reefs. So she prints them in order to save, the ocean and the species in the ocean. And she's very successful with it. She's founded a company. It's called Reefs. But again, the press that the attempt that we had to communicate that exhibition and this TV program was not as successful as it would have been a product-related exhibition, because people still don't find the right terminologies or the right framework to establish this kind of expanding view of design.
I think that's definitely true of the specialist design media. And if we exclude, say, lifestyle media from this, because they are about lifestyle, so therefore they are inevitably going to focus on product, furniture and interiors. But if you look at the general media, there is more and more serious and intelligent interest in an expansive and eclectic, politically, socially and ecologically focused vision of design. You look at the New Yorker, which has had a succession of phenomenal essays on all those subjects. The New York Times and The Guardian are also devoting more and more space to that, as are literary journals like the New York Review of Books. And I think the pandemic had quite a lot to do with that, because particularly at the beginning, when no one, even the world's greatest medical experts and scientists, really knew what COVID-19 was, the design responses to the pandemic for a time were the only good news stories that the media had. But also because people were familiar with the underlying challenge of helping us to manage the risk of infection and eventually to curb it, they understood the intended function of those design projects. And I think that first of all, design commandeered a far greater amount of space and noise within the general media, and in an intelligent and enlightened way. And I'm confident that that will continue. So I think there may be the sort of more old-fashioned design community that's still very much focused, as you say, Matylda, on pretty pictures of three-dimensional objects. But I'm cautiously confident that the rest of the media will outpace it. And so hopefully this will foster a more enlightened and sophisticated general understanding of design and why we need it and why it should be entrusted to tackle the complex and systemic challenges of our time.
I mean, I wouldn't be optimistic. I mean, I wouldn't do it if I wouldn't be optimistic about it, but I do. And it doesn't matter which project I start, it doesn't matter which consulate it is, because I usually, similar to you, Alice, I don't necessarily work for one nationality, one country. I do think about the discipline more as something that should not be discussed within national borders, which is also an issue when you think about funding, But I do realize that whenever I teach that these young students, they ask really themselves how to access these platforms, and how make sure that they will be written about or that will be exposed without actually a commercial entity that actually asks for a lot of money, because I sometimes really dream to make an exhibition that is just called Design but Privilege. And then we would really look at the facts, who is able to be and become a designer or work within design, and whatever the structures, the support structures that are there, that is sometimes it's money, sometimes it's power, sometimes it's accessibility. But you just have to ask yourself, is this discipline does it even have a potential, or is it even inclusive in that kind of sense? Or will it ever be if you need a certain income to be part of a discourse?
Well, that is a very, very important and valid point. And unfortunately, it also pertains to so many cultural activities, whether it's for artists, writers, and so on. And also whether design becomes truly diverse and inclusive isn't just a gender issue. It's a much, much broader issue than that, but it has absolutely got to be tackled, because if you believe, as we all do, that design is a powerful tool, not a panacea, but a useful tool that can help us to tackle these systemic and intersectional challenges at a time when, because of COVID-19, hopefully this will be a landmark moment for change and progress, as previous global emergencies have been, the Black Death, world wars, and so on, then it stands to reason we need the best possible designers, and we're not going to get them if they come from one strand of ethnicity, one geography, one demographic, and one gender.
Absolutely.
It's actually something we also looked at with our exhibition in the contemporary part, was to kind of look at the initiatives. I'd like to kind of go there in a minute if we can, because I'm realizing we have limited time to sort of think about formats or tools, how to address all those issues. We didn't talk so much about them anymore in terms of gender just then, because it does broaden out into lots of other areas. But one thing I did and do find is that educational institutions and the courses within them and the professors who teach there and so on, that is also a huge gatekeeping mechanism. As you said, Matylda, that example was brilliant, to say like, well, she almost wasn't able to graduate because it didn't correspond to the expectations there. And so one project that I'm really fascinated by and love is the Futurist community and platform, which we're showing in the very contemporary part of our exhibition, because what they really are, amongst other things, trying to do is kind of create networks that you would usually find at educational institutions, but create them kind of globally through digital channels where everyone can participate, and you have quite a different conversation to the one that you would have sitting in a history lecture at a institution where the history lectures never change. The protagonists that are being named are always the same. So I do find those models incredibly interesting as well, to kind of rethink education and what that means. Matylda, you're also probably very engaged in that conversation, right?
Whereas, Katyn, I've been inspired by the work of Nina Pime from the beginning, and I've been huge supporters, the kind of network that she also built, and how they really want to expand the practice also and she's a graphic designer first, but she really built something that is extremely fascinating. But again, she does it as some sort of I wouldn't even call it a company, but it is a system, an initiative. But she's also running it with a lot of constraints, because who's funding that kind of activism? It's a form of activism. And she constantly, especially living now in Switzerland, she has to argue for that kind of writing design, or being activist within design. She has to argue for that all the time. And again, we go then to this kind of stereotype of what design is in the worldview of a majority of gatekeepers. So they don't think that something like that should be funding. But it's easy to say, if you on the privileged side, that you don't want to distribute funds or don't want to have the possibility to grow that network, because why should you? If you're comfortable, you may possibly maybe don't want to make anyone comfortable because you're in the power position. So yeah, but yeah.
Yeah, but I think that's true. I mean, I really understand what you're saying. So I think what I would like to do is really talk about like what mechanisms might we need to change to have sort of more voices at the table, both historically in terms of including women in design, but also going forward to think about just a more inclusive practice of designing, making exhibitions of design. I also was quite interested in something that you said in the conversation that we had previously, where yes, we didn't have a catalogue. You mentioned that before, And we're currently thinking about how to do that, because for many reasons it wasn't possible to do it while we were doing the exhibition, which happened during the pandemic, and it's a very difficult time for us. But now we're thinking about how can we don't want it to go without a catalogue, but how can we now do it? Do we now do a book retrospectively? And in many ways, the pandemic has triggered us to rethink that format too, like to say, well, is a catalogue really the best way of recording this? Because it'll be quite closed. It'll be a book that's only available to some. It can't be extended. It would mean that in our case, we would do it afterwards, but in normal exhibition cycles, you do it a long time before, which then constrains again how you can kind of deal with the exhibition. So what I would like to talk a little bit about is sort of formats, how we might, you both have introduced some really interesting formats with what you're doing that are completely, I would say, innovative in the way that they distribute information and how you think about it. So how might we do it going forward, both within institutions that might change and also outside of them?
Well, I think one interesting model is Bauhaus Imaginista, which was a transnational collaborative in terms of institutions and individual researchers research platform that was initiated as part of the Bauhaus centenary, and it's an online journal. So it's instantly and freely accessible. It's a very wide range of voices, going back to Matylda's point about who is invited to contribute, to speak on such forums. And although its submission is not gender specific, I do find it an inclusive platform. There's lots of information about female students and teachers at the Bauhaus and the sort of queer, subversive, maverick and radical Bauhauslers. And for me personally, it's a fantastic research resource, and I'm happy that young people will be introduced to design history through such a democratic tool. And I would have thought you could easily build on all the research you've compiled for this exhibition with such a tool. Or for example, given that catalogues are expensive to produce, expensive for people to buy, ecologically wasteful, present the catalogue as a QR code, which is something that we're considering doing for the book that Paula and I are writing on design emergency. So the digital technology gives us all sorts of new tools to play with. But obviously exhibition catalogues are only one format of conveying information and extending knowledge and challenging stereotypes. There are so many more on a strictly informal and improvisational level. I mean, Matylda alluded earlier to always making sure that you have a completely diverse program, and Paula and I tie ourselves up in knots trying to do that with design emergency, not only in terms of gender, but also in terms of geography and ethnicity and heritage. And we will never get it right. We always inevitably actually end up with a female majority, certainly a slight one, but we've always got to continue working to make it better as we can. I think another area of design that really needs radical change is language. Now, we've alluded to this, a sort of the fluidity, the fragmentation of gender identities, and the battle over semantics, over pronouns, is one that's been amply covered in the media, but it's a hugely important one because words are so powerful and they can be so hurtful if they're misapplied intentionally or unintentionally, and so valuable if they're applied positively. So just as there's a battle in terms of general languages over the use of pronouns, and I know this is even more complex in German than it is in English, given that so many more nouns are gendered. Specifically, but in design, I mean, one of the reasons why all the discrimination and prejudice we're complaining, quite rightly, of course, about in design applies to so many other sectors too. and I hate to say this, but I do think it's worse in design. And I think one of the reasons is that the male dominance of design is absolutely reinforced by design language. I mean, as a feminist, there are certain words I do not use. So the use of master, i.e. uber masculine, in terms of masterpiece, masterwork, master of, maestro. I mean, design books are full of this misogynistic use of language, and we need to come up with alternatives.
It makes me actually very much think while you were speaking, Alice, something that, and I really like to talk about this topic also out of, examples of experiences, like, I mean, a few months ago, I was approached by a design academy student, like a former design academy student, she finished her studies a while ago. And she just got from, and she's originally from Hong Kong, and she did this huge Young Design Talent Award, which is a money prize for a year, where she has to pick a mentor that she will work with for a year. She asked me, and I said yes. I was excited.
Yeah.
They said no, because I'm too young and because I'm a woman. And they picked a man that I'm not going to say who it is, but we all know him, that is only 15 years older than me and apparently much more experienced, So we have to really unlearn these stereotypes and expectations and assumptions of quality. Like, it's almost like, like sometimes I wish I would have the power of these guys in Men in Black, where they come with this kind of device and delete the memory of everyone. So we can really start from scratch and really look at the things as they are and not assume how they are, because that's a little bit, it's about like how we are forced to some kind of perceptions. It's like we have to really change the perception of quality in that kind of sense. And of course, as we already said in the beginning of the conversation, is next to quality and language, but also money distribution, I sometimes have a feeling, and it starts with how women are often very differently paid than men. And there's always this turn where I have experienced it very often, the women didn't have asked for it. That's not true. I've had also once in London during an Adobe event, there was 3 speakers. There's 2 men who both said they didn't get paid, and the only person in this between 3 speakers was a woman who said, "Oh, but I asked for the 7 days in the Ace Hotel and I got £500." So again, it's not gendered. It's about what you learn and how you also experience to ask for certain things. But on the other hand, you also have to have the mechanisms and the possibility or provide the possibility for other people that are less privileged to be able to ask for it or take it.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I do think the one thing that we were thinking of when we were making this exhibition, which of course is, as I said, like quite limited. We were working from our collection. I think we made a huge kind of progress in terms of how we think about it, how that might affect our exhibition practice in the future. There are no firm answers, but I feel like it. But the whole time we were also thinking like, well, maybe we need some kind of manifesto or some sort of like things that you were saying before, Alice, where it's like, we need to change the language around it. Maybe we really need to think about who's funding what and who's being paid. I also think like issues like collaboration, which we haven't touched about on here, but I've really found a lot about that as well, that design is a collaborative effort, yet our systems of recognition you don't really think about that. It doesn't honor it. There's always the author or the genius. And also things like motherhood. There's an excellent exhibition initiative now, which was also done in quite a different way by Michelle Miller-Fisher, called Designing Motherhood, which sort of looks at those things. So I think it would be really nice sort of keeping those discussions open and also finding really simple ways of thinking about things like you said, Matylda, where it's like always make sure you invite, I think it was then at the time like a woman, and Alice, you said we always have too many women in the end now, but invite someone you don't know, think about how things could be done differently. Would be really good to kind of maintain that somewhere, or exchange experiences, to ensure that it's not just one exhibition or one project here or one project there, but that the kind of I suppose learnings from it get collected somewhere. That's really something that I'm thinking about in terms of a catalogue. I don't almost feel anymore like making just an exhibition catalogue about this. I feel like rounding up a whole lot of experiences and then going forward with another resource.
But I really have to say it again, like women so often in all spheres of life are the forefront of game changers, you know, and system changers. And it's great that it's been done. Also, like with the example that you said, Futures, you know, that really try to change with workshop activism, group activities, change the perception of what it is to be, you know, like in that case, a woman within the society. But I think we really have to shift it to questioning what is the picture and the role of a man in the 21st century, you know, because I want them to talk about what they would change, how would they change to come closer to us and not, and give the space away, basically.
I think we need to wrap it up very soon. And I don't want to start going into another direction. I could definitely would love to keep talking and touch on a whole lot of other things, but we might have to leave that to another conversation. And I do, in that spirit, want to say it was one conversation now, but I really do feel like it would be great if we would meet again on this topic or on another. And I really want to thank you for your time. And we will speak with each other again, no doubt.
Okay, thank you so much, Viviane.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Okay,
Bye.
bye.